When did they actually stop celebrating the liturgy of St. James? Was it like a gradual sort of thing, or did they keep it for like big days?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Basically, from, let's say, the 4th century until the 10th century, this would have been the standard liturgy for Jerusalem, not in exactly the same form as one would see it today in the Orthodox Church or in any churches of the Byzantine Rite, but more or less the anaphora would be similar. Then we have witnesses that say that it would have been celebrated probably on major feast days, probably Sundays, or several times a year, the way the liturgy of St. Basil is celebrated today in the Byzantine Rite on 10 days. And then it seems that in the monastic context, it disappeared completely. At the Holy Sepulchre, as I mentioned, they continued it until the 12th century, and then by the 13th century, it kind of disappears everywhere. Manuscripts of this liturgy continue to be copied, however, in the West. Well, the West meaning southern Italy and the Greek islands or western mainland Greece, and very often for purposes of debate with Western Christians. So in the West, they're interested to know, what do these Greeks believe? And so they copy their liturgical texts. And so you have a lot of these compilations of liturgies so that the Western theologians can study them, especially in the time of councils like Lyon or Florence. And so you have copies of these liturgies, but it seems they probably weren't used. And then all of a sudden, in the end of the 19th century, we have a revival of this liturgy. And that's a whole other question, but basically the summary version of the modern history of this liturgy is what is celebrated today is not at all the way it would have been celebrated in Jerusalem in the 4th or to 10th or 12th century. There are no manuscripts. For example, here is let me find it. This scroll of the liturgy of St. James, for example. Rubrics are limited to titles of prayers. And in the liturgy of St. James, as it's celebrated today, it says, the deacon should face the people, the bishop should celebrate without a mitre, you should stand in front of the icon screen, and various other rubrics. Those are basically inventions of the late 19th century and early 20th century, but that's a whole other question. So,
Is Egeria the earliest witness we have to this liturgy, or do we have any witnesses from the 2nd or 3rd centuries?
Well, there are earlier pilgrim accounts, like the Pilgrim from Bordeaux, but he doesn't describe the liturgy in such detail, and he's, I think, 333 or something like that. But the whole problem is that until Constantine, you couldn't do any of this, because he's the one that builds big churches on holy sites. So he kind of establishes the sacred topography of Jerusalem, builds the Holy Sepulchre, builds a church on the Mount of Olives, builds the Basilica in Bethlehem, builds the Church of Zion, and that allows for kind of the infrastructure for these liturgies to be celebrated. So Egeria is probably the earliest, most detailed witness, although she's also kind of ambiguous in certain cases. But yeah, she's describing a liturgy that's contemporaneous to what St. Cyril of Jerusalem would have been describing. So you can sometimes put the two things together, but not always with great success.
Does the liturgy of St. James, as it's celebrated by the Syriac Orthodox, Malankara Orthodox, and the Syriac Catholics and Syro-Malankara Catholics today, is that a pristine form based on what you know of the anaphora, or is that itself a separate history as to how the Syriac liturgy of St. James has diverged from the Greek?
Yeah, I can't say much about that, except that there are already from early times two different traditions, Syriac and Greek version, and then there's also Georgian translations, and so these are kind of two distinct traditions. In terms of their basic structure and content, it's more or less the same thing. But to talk about a pristine form of liturgy of St. James would kind of be going into an area that I would have questions about to the scholars that try to do that. I won't name any names. But in Jerusalem, it's very often the case that once you have a translation of something, it's hard to tell what the original is, because even in the hymnography that I pointed out, the Georgian version for the hymn of Pentecost is different from the Greek hymn of Pentecost, and sometimes you see kind of two parallel traditions, so it's unclear whether this is just a change from one century to another, or one is older, which one is older, so...
whether there was multiplicity from the beginning.
Yeah. So in general, when other scholars have looked at the order of the lectionary, there are certain things that are very clear and always the same. And then when you get outside these major times of the liturgical year, like some kind of sequence of readings from the Gospel of Matthew, there's a lot of variety there. So it's like Swiss cheese, but with more holes than cheese.
Holy holes.
Yes, of course. I mean, in terms of the sources. Yes, not the liturgy. Yes. Okay. Yes.
One last question.
Okay. You showed us a slide of the Holy Sepulchre in 3 different sections, where you were attributing the changes primarily to destruction of the church and destruction of other holy sites. My question is related to that. I'd like to know if textual changes made any changes in the architecture, and textual changes also in if there are rubrical textual changes that shift from the second to the from the first, second to third.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, because generally we don't have a lot of rubrics. We have basic notes, but the manuscript that I started out with from the 12th century is the most comprehensive in terms of describing what everybody does. It's basically like the ideal liturgical book for Holy Week, because it has the text for every single person, from the patriarch to the chanters, and then rubrics in between. It even talks about this order of myrrh-bearing women that are supposed to go and incense around the Holy Sepulchre, and various monks that come and do various things. And that one has a lot of details, and so some scholars were trying to say that it would be impossible to serve it in this version of the church here after Al-Hakim, because the rebuilt basilica, which is here from the time of Constantine, was not rebuilt. It was just modified into a small chapel here. But nevertheless, the manuscripts don't go into such detail that they say whether, they don't say how long you're supposed to walk or where. They say generally where you're supposed to go, but not necessarily how. And this manuscript from the 12th century does mention, it seems, the Dome of the Rock, or structures on Temple Mount, which would have been abandoned in the Byzantine period. So it does suggest that this was a 12th century copy. With regard to other rubrics and modifications to holy sites, there was a study by an archaeologist in Israel, Joseph Patriarchs, who tried to enter into debate with Father Taft, which is not always possible, because Father Taft doesn't like to listen. But he basically pointed out to modifications to basically the sanctuary area of churches, which would have facilitated like a transfer of gifts procession more easily, but this all happens by the 6th century, so it's probably something that's just naturally developing rather than some kind of direct Byzantine influence. But there are theories also that there would be fewer processions, and there might have been even like a preparation of the gifts on the altar itself in some forms of the liturgy of St. James, so even fewer rubrics and things like that, but more from a monastic context, perhaps. Yeah.
We promised we would finish by now, so Daniel, again, profound thanks.